Hey, Adam here from the Colorado Capitol. You can see the gold dome behind me. This is episode 2. It's my little intro for you. It's an update because unfortunately part of it is already out of date. We recorded 2 weeks ago. A lot is moving quickly here in Colorado especially, but also at the federal level. I wanted to give you an update in Colorado. We did manage to get some language into an appropriations bill. It's the Species Conservation Trust Fund. Unfortunately, that bill is an appropriations bill, and it's pretty much a sacred cow for the conservation community, and it's losing money every year. So people got really nervous about it, and that our language was stripped out. But that's okay. These things happen. Laws are not easy to pass. That's why I'm here today, finding another way forward, and I think I'm making some great progress. But this episode touches barely on that, but more importantly, it pans out to the federal level and discusses the model that we're pursuing there in D.C., trying to save the chicken in terms of putting the conservation on the ground. We call it the grand bargain. We also talk a good bit about the American burying beetle, which is a case study that shows us that with the right conservation in the right place, you can get animals off the list. And then finally, we define what a stronghold is, and we talk about why it's important for the prairie chicken's future. It's also important for ranching's future. So I hope you enjoy it. It's 47 minutes long. It's well worth the watch. Appreciate it, y'all.
Wayne, welcome back. We ended our last conversation with a bit of a teaser regarding the idea of, well, what I'm going to call a grand bargain. And, basically what I think is going to matter most here is that we have a different path forward for the lesser prairie chicken. Now, granted, we've spent millions of dollars and, 12, 15 years trying to put together different instruments, for lack of a better term, right? Our programmatic conservation banking agreement that allows us to approve and establish conservation banks across the range in relatively short order, which has been great. We have 4 different conservation banks approved and operating, and we're working on a 5th. But we can continue to add to that number. And we also have these habitat conservation plans, which we talked a little bit about in our last episode. And what I think we started to hint at was that, relying on those habitat conservation plans and pulling in conservation from our conservation banks is certainly helpful, but it's not necessarily going to get us where we need to be in order to, help the bird recover, right? And we did some butchered math there, but we got to it, which is the concept that for every acre of impact, you get a couple of acres of offset. So really at the end of the project life, you end up with 1 extra acre to the good in that math. And we're talking, a minimal need of 750,000 acres, 500,000 acres, somewhere in there to make some of the experts in the chicken world feel comfortable that the bird has what it needs. So that takes a long time, and that takes a lot of industry impacts on the ground, and a lot of these projects, which have, decadal planning cycles, right? These transmission lines can sometimes have permitting windows of 10 plus years, and that involves siting, that involves land rights, that involves NEPA analyses, that involves ESA, that involves Clean Water Act permits, and ESA being Endangered Species Act. So to get to recovery through these HCPs, I think it's just going to be hard and it's going to take a long time. We have started talking about the conditions on the ground, right? The political conditions right now, that's the Trump administration, and the Trump administration's goals of deregulation and energy dominance, and seeing if we couldn't piece together a faster way to get a bunch of recovery acres on the table that ultimately could lead to a no listing scenario, so that the ranchers don't have to worry about the feds governing their ranching activity. And more importantly, with respect to industry, transmission doesn't have to worry about ESA permitting. Oil and gas doesn't have to worry about ESA permitting, and all the tie-ins that go into these transmission lines, whether that's wind, solar, battery storage, whatever the case may be, data centers, they don't have to worry about the permitting. So from a real high level, Wayne, if you don't mind, how about you just share with everybody, what you see as the limitations to these permitting programs in terms of getting to recovery, and maybe even, if you could share with us your experience with the American burying beetle. And I think that, the audience would be interested in hearing how that mitigation program appeared to lead to a delisting.
Sure, Adam. Well, thanks for having me again and welcome to the listeners. Look, after seeing all this stuff play out for a couple decades, ultimately the species and the landowners that harbor their habitat, they need a grand bargain. Like that's the one thing you kind of don't see is, the programs are created traditionally with a heavy industry and or political component to them, and those parties are focused on getting permitting certainty at the cheapest, least cost. And unfortunately, that kind of leads to least benefit on the ground for the landowners and for the habitat and for the species themselves in terms of not only effective offsets, but trying to have some level of recovery. So, mitigation, as you say, alone typically doesn't get it done because in mitigation you're trying to, even though you have a 2-to-1 preference that favors the resource, the habitat, due to time and a lot of other complicated factors in mother nature, you're kind of just holding the line, right? You're trying not to lose more habitat. You're trying to hold the line with effective offsets. Sometimes those programs can give you benefits. In the case of the prairie chicken, we've seen a lot of programs over the years, legacy programs. We've talked about them before, Waffle, Kim, Farm Bill programs. A lot of good intentions there, but at the end of the day, the lesser prairie chicken unfortunately continues to lose habitat. We got to build back habitat through, we think we can do that, like you said, through our banks and our HCPs. But instead of just having credits being purchased for mitigation, we'd like to see and believe that can play a huge role in recovery. So, if we could get a party such as the government or industry to buy a large chunk of credits, you could build out hundreds of thousands of acres of strongholds, and all of a sudden the landowners are winning and the bird's going to win. The American burying beetle, while it was a few years ago, was a real big success, and that's another species that has a long tainted history of various programs, the biggest program being what they call an in-lieu fee program that was run between the Oklahoma Department of Transportation and the Nature Conservancy of Oklahoma. I know the TNC folks in Oklahoma, they're great folks, but that program, kind of didn't deliver the goods for the same reason a lot of in-lieu fee programs don't. And for the listeners who don't know what in-lieu fee programs are, essentially the price is set, a fixed fee for impact is set up front, not really understanding what it's going to take on the ground to have an effective offset. So you get cheap prices for regulatory compliance. The fees are collected now, typically by a state agency or a nonprofit group. Sometimes those nonprofit groups are industry sponsored, and then they hope to deliver effective offsets on the ground later. But inevitably, what seems to happen is the price that the fee is set is too low to actually get mitigation done in the right places at the right time and the right price that's durable to deliver that effective offset. So, again, 4 or 5 years down the road, these sort of disconnects are figured out and it doesn't work. In the case of the beetle, the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2012 really kind of happened with the Trans-Canadian Pipeline. So Keystone, TransCanada was building the Keystone Pipeline, the southern leg. It actually had a lot of bipartisan support. It was coming along down through eastern Oklahoma. They needed to get this thing permitted. Right on top of that, the service figured out there was a lot of kind of stuff internally that wasn't that pretty, that the in-lieu fee program wasn't working. So they shelved it, they shut it down, and they created a new, what they call GCP, General Conservation Plan, which is essentially an HCP like Adam and I have, administrated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then they created that plan. They created guidance for mitigation all at once, which is pretty efficient for the government, actually. And folks like my company and my partner Wildwood out of East Texas and other mitigation providers did what the market does. We ran out there. We found the best sites to offset impacts to the American burying beetle. We got those approved rapidly as conservation banks. We did a custom bank for the Trans-Canada pipeline to get that going in 2012, and then other primarily oil and gas, but also some wind folks and transmission folks used that GCP or created their own HCPs later to purchase credits. So, and the way the beetle was successful is we flipped the script on, again, instead of just saying, developers are willing to pay X and that's all they're willing to pay. It was like, the market was able to provide a price point through multiple mitigation providers that said, hey, it's going to cost you this much to have effective offsets. And so then there was a market. It worked well. We put, the beetle had just been suffering losses and losses and losses for years. The old mitigation program, which was primarily protecting places that were already protected that the Nature Conservancy owned. And we actually were delivering some benefits of new conservation gains for the beetle at the rigorous standards the Fish and Wildlife Service required. And then that, along with other factors, allowed the American Bergen beetle to be downlisted a few years later, just a threatened. And, the private market and conservation banks were a big part of that.
Great. Thanks, Wayne. And in your opinion, do you think that a lesser prairie chicken mitigation program can lead to a delisting in and of itself? Or do you think we need extra help here?
Yeah, we're going to need extra help. We're going to need a surge in conservation. It's like we had a surge, years ago in Iraq. We may have a surge in Iran. Who knows? But you've got to have that surge of conservation to stop the ongoing loss over time that occurs through whether it's programs that just didn't deliver or the on again, off again pendulum of the Endangered Species Act regulatory, ball there. So yeah, you're going to have to search. This bird, as we talked before, Adam, is habitat limited. We got about 25,000 birds. We haven't been able to improve that number despite a lot of hard work by a lot of folks over the last almost 13 years now since the range-wide plan came out in WAFWA. And we've just got to get in there and protect the last best areas of strongholds and start restoring the land within and around those strongholds, build them out to build back that genetic stock of birds and number of birds so that then as more habitat gets built back through restoration over time and durable easements is protected, we can start increasing the number of birds finally without increasing the habitat and just trying to hold the line. Even with the best mitigation programs like ours, it's going to be very difficult to bring the bird back.
And you mentioned strongholds. How about spending a little bit of time, defining what a stronghold is and spend a little bit of time sharing with everyone where these strongholds need to be relative to the 5-state range. I don't know that everybody appreciates just how widespread this range is. And hopefully we'll have a nice graphic here to go along with this conversation so people have a better grasp of where the birds are. But walk the viewers and listeners through what a stronghold is and where they need to be.
Sure. Well, I'd like to remind the viewers that you and I are passionate entrepreneur conservation business people, do not have a biology degree. So I'm sure I'll say some things that will offend some of the tried and true pure blood biologists, both at the federal, state, and academic levels. But generally a stronghold as defined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and again, that's the standards that we live by, is 25 to 50,000 contiguous or almost 100% contiguous acres of grassland, native prairie, that the lesser prairie chicken needs landscapes of that size to maintain localized, genetically viable populations. So that's what a stronghold is. And there's not many left. This bird used to have about a 20 million acre range, depending on whose maps you believe and which academic, sort of papers you read and which state and federal biologists you talk to, we're down to just a few million acres of viable habitat. And we're still losing about 2 million acres a year in grasslands across the Great Plains. That's not just all in the Southwestern Plains, but that's still, these birds are still losing grassland to energy development and agriculture and conversion, as we talked about previously. There's about 12 to 14 areas by our work that could become strongholds. Obviously, all our current banks are being put to, we've sold credits in stronghold areas. We haven't quite achieved getting 25,000 acres in any one location yet, but we're very close in Kansas. We're getting very close. Actually, I think you'll have one in New Mexico, the latest deal you did with the partnerships you have with the state, et cetera, and some of the NGOs and other landowners. But, we need to build those strongholds out. So the idea is to build several strongholds, possibly up to 10 or more strongholds, and then over time build out from those strongholds. So get your 25 to 50,000 acres in place, then continue to build those out, reconnect other disparate populations, convert farmland back to grassland, get rid of woody species encroachment areas to make grassland that's already there more productive for prairie chickens and for things like livestock. That's essentially what we're trying to do with the stronghold strategy and the grand bargain.
Right. And of course, the range is broken up, at least by Fish and Wildlife Standards, into what we call eco regions.
Mm-hmm.
So down in West Texas, eastern New Mexico, that's the Shinnery Oak. Up in Colorado and, southeast Colorado, western Kansas, that's the sand sagebrush. And then we have the mixed grass and the short grass prairies in Kansas. So that's 4 different eco regions. We would need, at least one or strongholds per each of those.
Correct.
And I would say more for sure. And don't worry, Wayne, I do have a biology degree and it doesn't help. Don't feel bad. Okay, great. So we talked about the strongholds. We talked about the need for something bigger. When we talk about the need for something bigger and we talk about how we can fund the engine to get to the stronghold strategy you just laid out across multiple ecoregions, across 5-state range, I think the easiest answer, and it ain't easy, is government money, right? The scale of the investment required to get to 750,000 acres is mind blowing to me. And I don't think politically and financially 750,000 acres is something that the government is just going to, sure, great, we'll do that. And I don't think that industry is going to come out of pocket to do that on their own, at least not proactively. They may do it over a very long period of time, project by project, mitigating their way through. And by mitigate, by the way, folks, what I mean by that is the truest definition is to reduce the impact of something you're doing on the ground. That really means offsets in our world. So anytime Wayne and I say mitigate, we mean purchase conservation at some ratio that's higher than the losses are on the ground. So that's mitigate. So we can't purchase offsets through industry projects to get us to that 750,000 acres, that is. And maybe we don't need the 750,000 acres today, but we need a significant step in that direction. So this is what we call the grand bargain. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes here summarizing our thinking here. And Wayne, I'll kick it back to you and fill in the gaps for everybody as I leave them behind. But right now, politically, what we're looking at is the Trump administration has come into their second term. They have established some pretty clear priorities by way of executive order, by way of just the way that they talk to the press. So I think it's crystal clear that this administration wants energy dominance, to use their term, and they also want a significant deregulatory push. I think the deregulation push is 10 to 1. So remove 10 regulations for every one that they end up writing. And they do intend to write regulations. They have something referred to as the Unified Regulatory Agenda. I encourage people to look that up. That's a clear signal as to what the regulatory actions of each administration are, and they put it out periodically. I think it's annually, maybe even more frequently than that. So there are regulations coming out of this administration, but that regulatory agenda also presents deregulatory action. So it's interesting to see that as well. And right now, we are in a position where there was a court settlement last summer out of a federal court in Midland, Texas, that allowed basically the 5 states attorneys general, I'm sorry, 3 Republican states attorneys general, so that's Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, along with the Permian Basin Petroleum Association, effectively sued Fish and Wildlife Service on administrative grounds for the lesser prairie chicken listing. And ultimately, they settled with Trump's DOJ and Trump's Department of Interior, so Department of Justice, Department of Interior, to vacate the listing. That means just throw it out on administrative grounds and then send the listing decision back to the service. And we talked just a little bit about that in the last episode, that they have an ambitious timeline of the end of November 2026 to reach another listing decision for the lesser prairie chicken. And so, given that the Trump administration is interested in energy dominance and interested in deregulation, this is a great opportunity for the Trump administration to hit both of those targets in the southern Great Plains with respect to lesser prairie chicken. But when you read through all the Fish and Wildlife Service's records of decision, which are like species status assessments, even the defense of the listing decisions in two different court cases where Fish and Wildlife provides testimony in writing and in person regarding the status of the lesser prairie chicken, it is crystal clear that the experts, the regulatory experts, the biological experts, feel that the chicken is not in good shape, feel that there's not enough good, durable conservation on the ground to prevent the bird from being endangered at some point in the foreseeable future, or even becoming extinct in the foreseeable future. So if the Trump administration simply jumps to a what they call not warranted decision for the listing, right? That's just saying, hey, we looked at everything, the bird's doing great, let's not list it. If they jump to that, yeah, Wayne's shaking his head because that means that the decision is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to legal action. And there are dozens of environmental NGOs like Centers for Biological Diversity, Earth Justice. There's a long list of them that are watching this decision. And they may very well file suit if there's a hasty decision made by this administration that is not defensible. And so they'll test it through the courts. So what we're proposing is to use this moment in time where the Trump administration is going to decide the listing status of the bird, but also use this moment in time where the Trump administration has impounded funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. And what I mean by impounded is they basically have stopped funds from going out from Department of Energy as well as the USDA that Congress appropriated through the Inflation Reduction Act. And as a reminder to everybody, that was done late in the last Congress, which was a Democratic Congress, and it was signed by President Biden. A lot of the congressional intent of that bill has to do with spending money for renewable energy. Transmission build out is included, as well as clearing the skids for a renewable build out so that we can have this energy transition that the Democrats were interested in for climate change purposes. Trump was not comfortable with that. So back to the impoundment, he has basically held on to any funds that weren't spent. Then this Congress, after the one big beautiful bill, rescinded a lot of those funds. So some of those unspent funds have come back to the Treasury. Other funds are still there at Department of Energy as well as at USDA that are IRA funds, but now the Trump administration is trying to decide how best to spend them. And that is our leverage point with our conversations with Department of Interior is you have this listing decision that you would love to find a way to get to not warranted, or at least something that doesn't list the bird and doesn't get in the way of industry development across the Southern Great Plains. And then we know that you have these IRA funds that have clear congressional intent to be used in specific ways, but you're trying to use them in ways that meet the energy dominance goals of the administration, which, as we all know, doesn't necessarily mean wind towers in particular. So that is the point of the confluence that we're trying to work with to repurpose some of those funds to purchase recovery acres across the lesser prairie chicken range. And I think that with those funds, where we're talking, just as an example, Department of Energy has somewhere in the neighborhood of $70 billion that are IRA or Inflation Reduction Act funds. USDA has another very large share. I'm not sure the number, but we'll get that to you here soon. And we could use those funds to purchase recovery acres and get the administration to a not warranted listing. So, Wayne, that's the grand bargain, right? Where I think industry wouldn't have to worry about permitting. That includes the Colorado Power Pathway, which, as we talked about in the last episode, is hundreds of miles of transmission lines. And there will be, I believe the number is 5,500 megawatts of renewable energy is the goal to tie into that. So that's a really big deal. And we could clear the decks using this IRA money for the CPP. We could also clear the decks for oil and gas. Because as you remember, Permian Basin, which is the granddaddy of all North American shale plays, there's two other basins that are considered tier 1 basins, also covered by the Chicken Range. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other transmission projects that are happening for grid capacity reasons, grid reliability reasons, electrification of oil and gas reasons, as well as renewable energy that's happening down in eastern New Mexico in particular, and West Texas in particular. So that's our idea of a grand bargain. Fill in any dots there, but also add some color. How big of a challenge is this? It might sound cool, but how big of a challenge do you see this being?
Sure, yeah, it's a big challenge. If it wasn't a challenge, we would be sitting here today talking about this problem, right? This tension between energy development, ranchers needing to make market-based rates for conservation, and actually doing conservation that helps the intended, species in question, in this case, lesser prairie chicken. I do want to say real quick, because I know our audience here, Ab and I are not one as private industry for-profit entrepreneurs. We'd hope this problem could be solved without having a special kind of government payment structure like this, right? But I think the reality is this challenge has been around for decades. This bird has been warranted for protection through many administrations, both Republican and Democrat, since 1998. We've tried all kinds of government programs. We've tried all kinds of public-private partnerships. They just haven't worked. And, it's because of things we've talked about before. We didn't get the right price point tied to the right performance metrics, and the bird continued to lose over time because conservation for the lesser prairie chicken could not compete with any other development type, whether it's traditional farming, wind development, oil and gas, whatever it is. It was, just wasn't economically competitive. So this is the new way forward. And it's a new way forward based on success we've actually seen with our program and a few other Endangered Species Act programs, other wetland and stream mitigation programs. When you get enough of a cash infusion to standards that actually help the owners of the habitat, the landowners, and the species itself, it can turn these situations around and get us backed away from the Endangered Species Act, swing of the wrecking ball there. And that's what we're trying to do here. But it is hard, right? I mean, it's not like these DOE funds or USDA funds were set aside for this vision, which just really kind of came about from Adam in the last few months. These things go back to the last administration. So we do think there is benefits, though, as Adam said, even though these funds may have been targeted more for specific farm programs or renewable programs, all these areas of the economy are going to benefit hugely because the lesser prairie chicken habitat sits on top of the area where we're trying to do all this energy development. And if we could get this bird in a good place, that legitimately is the populations are coming back. The landowners see the bird as a benefit, not a loss to their private property rights, and to help their operations, keep their kids on the farm or ranches, buy more cattle, expand ranches, send kids to college, et cetera, pay off debt. And the energy developers don't have to worry about some multi-year cumbersome bureaucratic process. They can go ahead knowing what the rules are to get things done quickly. It's a huge benefit to the country as a whole, and it's actually a better benefit to the taxpayer. And we've tried spending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars the old way, like I said, through Farm Bill And, we can all list out the programs, CRP, which had some success. You had the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative a few years ago with NRCS. They just haven't delivered durable gains. And this is a way forward to do it, using the market to make that happen.
Thanks, Wayne. And I would like to clarify a couple of things that you were hinting at there.
Right.
This is not your typical government dollars deployment program, right?
Right.
So FSA, NRCS, right? These are USDA programs. They typically spread big numbers, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. They spread it around large areas, and you do end up with measurable conservation, but you don't end up concentrating that conservation in any one, two, three, four, five areas. It's spread across multiple states, way more than the 5 states here. This would require USDA, if we're using USDA funds, to look at their priorities and hyper focus them on the chicken, so that we get the stronghold, we get the resources for the strongholds in those areas across the 5-state range. So it's a reimagining of the priorities that USDA currently has. That probably requires secretarial order. So that's a big deal. This is not something that, that just happens overnight. This takes a lot of thought, and it requires leadership from way up in order to demonstrate to the secretary that this is a priority of the administration. So that's how the White House. The other thing that I think is really important to note is the process would be very different here. This wouldn't be Rancher Joe, Rancher Jane, show up at your local FSA office, fill out an application, and wait for 6 months, and maybe you end up getting a contract for X number of dollars per acre per year for the next 15 years. This is very different. This would be cash from the federal government being used by way of our programmatic conservation banking agreement, which is important because it's the only instrument, approved fish and wildlife instrument available for recovery that we currently have. I know that WAFWA has a CCAA, that's a Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, which is a really convoluted way of saying, industry can agree to certain conservation practices, including offsets. So as they develop their projects, they put in more money, generate more mitigation or offsets. But we already talked about that, right? A mitigation program is not going to get us to where we have to go. Now, our programmatic conservation banking agreement is strictly conservation. That's all it is. It doesn't accommodate impacts on one end. That for us, that's what our habitat conservation plans are, and we talked about that in the last episode. For this context, the use of our programmatic conservation banking agreement would allow Fish and Wildlife Service to have the certainty of the quality of conservation and the location of the conservation to reach that not warranted decision that the administration wants to reach, because they know that the requirements inside of our PCBA for short require a conservation easement that meets fish and wildlife standards, so the ranch is permanently protected. It also allows grazing. That's important. A long-term management plan that is based on mostly managing chicken habitat by way of keeping woody species from encroaching, as they call it. And then finally, a non-wasting endowment that spins off interest every year to fund that long-term management plan. So those 3 things together give Fish and Wildlife the certainty they need that every acre that comes through our PCBA towards recovery. And that's key. So what we'd like to have happen is the government money from USDA, DOE, the White House saying, yes, this is a priority for us to make sure we don't list the bird. Then they can run that money through our programmatic conservation banking agreement so that every acre we put on the board, and I think the number is going to be in the neighborhood of, say, 250,000 acres, so that all 250,000 acres can give Fish and Wildlife the certainty they need to reach the right decision with the lesser prairie chicken listing. And that would, of course, clear the decks for transmission, renewables, oil and gas, and keep our ranching communities and our farming communities from feeling over-regulated themselves.
I think just one more comment on the government thing. I think of it kind of like, the government, we think of conservation and we are all kind of trapped in this farm bill mentality where the government will give you what they think is a reasonable price for you to enroll in these various programs. And while those programs have had some success, certainly on some of these species, they haven't. I think what we're suggesting is a more, forward-looking sort of government procurement model. So the government, they buy all kinds of things. They buy submarines, they buy Tomahawk missiles, they buy Ford pickup trucks. And, private industry makes those things. We believe our level of conservation, we can deliver it better than the government has because, we have to meet a standard the government sets and the market then determines how we meet that standard. And we can deliver these more durable strategic projects with the legs of the stool Adam was just talking about. So, it may seem like a lot of money when you start adding up, but, the government can get absolute defined certainty if this level of conservation is delivered and alleviate all these tensions that we've talked about and not rely on the old model of conservation or old model of partnerships that, I've had, about 30 years to try to solve this thing and they just haven't solved it. So we really believe the private sector and our solution and our people will jump in. It's not just going to be us. Our people will jump in if this thing works.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. I think there's two things that I'd like to hit on there as well. Number one, to your last point, you know, I'm actually the president of our trade association, the Ecological Restoration Business Association. I've been an active board member for, I guess, 8 years, give or take. I know most of my peers in the space. I work very closely with them. We collaborate all the time on policies and programs that lift the industry up itself. We do a really good job of taking our personal, selfish, business oriented minds and leaving them at the table and coming in with a collaborative mindset to build opportunities for all the companies in the space. And so anytime we have the opportunity to open a new market to our members, we jump at it. And that's exactly what we could do here with the government's help. And I do mean cash and support to have this objective of, providing enough conservation for the bird to keep it off the list. And we would provide our programmatic conservation banking agreement to any of our competitors as long as they have the right acres in the right location to meet the objectives of the administration to provide enough recovery acres to justify a not warranted listing. So we're open to that, and I think that makes the most sense because this is such a big operational lift that no one company is good enough to get it done in the time frame it needs to be done. So time frame, I think the best way to do it is for a very substantive or substantial investment in recovery acres needs to be made in the very near term. Because remember, this listing decision is supposedly going to be completed by the end of November of this year. So we certainly could help there. We have inventory of acres available, and I think that those acres would be a substantial demonstration of the model itself. But then you've got, you're going to have some continued commitment to get to that 250,000 acres. And Trump's term, the remainder of Trump's term, I think is sufficient. I think with the right interest from our peers as well as our own ability to leverage existing relationships we have in these key areas in these ranching communities where strongholds need to be established, as well as all the neighbors of the strongholds we're soon to establish and we've been developing, I think we can get there. I think we can absolutely get there. And we would invite our competitors, our peers to help us get there as well. So thanks for that, Wayne. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if we don't figure this out this time, we're going to be right back on the whipsaw, on the roller coaster of listings where Wayne and I have seen a listing, a delisting, a listing, a delisting, and we're about to see another listing decision. And if they choose not to list it, but they don't put the conservation up, I think we're going to find ourselves looking at a listing again. So it's just too complicated. It's too much on again, off again for industry to plan any of these really important infrastructure projects with any certainty. So we need that certainty moving forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Wayne, let's bring this grand bargain discussion back to Colorado. Help us understand when the bird was listed and we were servicing CPP projects by way of our HCP and our programmatic conservation banking agreement. That conservation wasn't coming from Colorado, was it?
No.
And it was coming from Kansas. And
Right.
help the listeners and the viewers understand why Kansas.
Sure. So when the bird was listed in the Endangered Species Act, that meant the jurisdiction was federal. Okay. And whether you look at the state led plan, the range wide plan circa 2013, or you look at the services, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's own guidance, they look at things on an ecosystem basis. And earlier in this podcast, you heard Adam talk about the ecosystems. I believe all these ecosystems stretch across at least 2 state lines. One of them, I think, stretches across 3 state lines in mixed grass prairie. So, the biologists, federal and state biologists determine these ecosystem boundaries. And a prairie chicken doesn't know where the state line between Kansas and Colorado is. It just goes where it's the most favorable conditions for it to live. And, for several reasons, grazing strategies, the way settlement played out over time, water agreements between states like Kansas and Colorado, there's just more birds in Kansas. And, Kansas clearly has the most prairie chickens of any state by far. I can't come up with the exact numbers in my head, but, of 25,000, Kansas has probably got at least 15,000 birds approximately. So as and Colorado doesn't have many. I don't know what the latest census is in Colorado. I know Adam works closely with the CPW folks, but, Colorado is known to have a very low population. Colorado has even partnered with Kansas wildlife departments in the past to try to capture birds, translocate them to Colorado to try to increase the population in areas where there's still good habitat, and just not getting traction for reasons that, only Mother Nature can probably understand and we haven't figured out yet. So when it came time to build out the CPP, both the transmission and the energy part of it, and it came time for folks like Tri-State to build out their transmission programs, and the bird was protected on the Endangered Species Act going back to 23, 24, and even up to August 25, they had to purchase credits from mitigation sites if you're transmission renewable using our HCP. And we talked to the service about putting conservation banks in Colorado. And we honestly were met with some understandable skepticism because the population numbers were there so low. So we focused our efforts on Kansas going back to 2013 and developed several banks there in areas that had long time PhD study work by Kansas State University. They tracked birds with GPS. They knew they had a lot of birds there. So our banks were rapidly approved. And that's where we had the mitigation. So although the impacts were happening, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the impacts were happening in both the shortgrass and sand sage. The service allowed us through our HCPs to sell credits from we'll call them our legacy Kansas banks, because they wanted to reward those landowners there to protect those bird populations. Because if those bird populations in Kansas aren't protected, we won't have any population sources to try to over time grow the population in Colorado. Having said that, Adam, I know you may want to talk about your efforts in trying to develop a conservation bank in Colorado over the last year, but we are rapidly trying to do that.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of the impacts for the Colorado Power Pathway are in the sand sagebrush. In fact, I think all the Colorado Power Pathway impacts are in the sand sagebrush inside of Colorado borders.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think we had a tri-state deal that we closed that crossed both of those ecoregions.
Right.
And went from Kansas into Colorado. So yes, the sand sagebrush is the predominant focus there. As far as the birds are concerned, in the sand sagebrush, the majority of them are in western Kansas, and they're not very far from the Colorado border, roughly 3 miles. Now, there are birds in Colorado. There are birds, inside the 3-mile buffer, if you will, along the border. But the vast majority, the reliable population is about 3 miles from the Colorado line. That doesn't mean that there's not habitat in Colorado. It just means that the better habitat is in Kansas. And so we can get the Colorado habitat up to snuff. And they do fly, folks. These birds aren't crossing the road on their feet. They actually fly. So they can go from the, 3 miles from the Kansas Colorado line, and they can cruise over. We just got to give them what they need inside of Colorado to do that. So to connect the dots between our grand bargain and what we talked about in the first episode, which was a Colorado law to, regulate its own resources with respect to the chicken, I think that those two things together really need to happen for Colorado's best interest. If Colorado were to pass a law that is, as overt as regulating chicken habitat, then I think that if the feds start spending money on recovery, they won't do what they've done several other times in the past, which is reflexively say, you've got to spend this, you've got to get these offsets, or you've got to get the conservation in Kansas where the birds are. I think at that point, they will see the political need for recovery acres in Colorado. And we could spend that money in a way that connects where the birds are in Kansas today to the good habitat in Colorado, right? So you really could have a stronghold that crosses the border. A chunk of it's in western Kansas, a chunk of it is in eastern Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, if the feds were to put up money for recovery acres, it could clear the decks for anything in Colorado in terms of the CP, wherein, the feds ultimately are paying to make sure there's good recovery conservation in Colorado. So it could nullify some of the needs and concerns that industry may have with the Colorado law. So I think all of this together is these are not individual actions that have their own, pathway. I think that together these actions in Colorado means we could lead to a situation where we have deregulation, we have energy dominance, and we ultimately allow industry and ranching to continue without big brother federal government or big brother state government looking over their shoulder. So Wayne, anything else you want to add as we close this thing up?
No, I think that's it, Adam. Appreciate you having me here.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here, and appreciate all you've done over the years for the chicken. So hopefully, with
You
any
and I
luck,
got a lot more to do. You're leading the charge now, but we got some more things to do the next few years to get this thing going the right direction.
yeah, we sure do. Hopefully, this story ends with one of the biggest conservation gains America's ever seen. So
Yeah, and
let's
as you
keep pushing.
know, it's the 250th anniversary of our country. Wow, wouldn't it be great to do at least 250,000 acres of conservation and
America deserves it.
actually
America deserves it.
help all these folks?
That's right. All right, Wayne. Great seeing you. And I'm heading back to Texas now. So
I'm heading to
hopefully the friendly
Kansas.
skies. All right, cool. Good seeing you. Take care.
Okay. Yeah, bye bye.